Hi, welcome back. I'm glad you could join us for our Pastor's Podcast. I'm Bob, joined here with Todd, and we are at Maranatha Bible Church. We're in Comstock Park, Michigan, just outside of Grand Rapids, and we are continuing our series. In fact, it's going to go through the month of April. We're going to continue talking about family matters, looking at some different aspects of the family. We've talked about raising kids, disciplining kids, discipling kids. We've talked about singles, husbands, wives, all those kind of things. And today we want to talk about something that is probably common to, every single family.
Probably.
So we want to talk about family conflict. So right away, we already talked about conflict in the church. So this was about a year or so ago that we talked about conflict in the church. So we want to start by saying, okay, you have conflict in the church, but does the Bible speak specifically to what that looks like in the household? Because there are some different dynamics. So we want to start there, point out some of the different dynamics of conflict within the church and conflict like within the family.
Obviously, there's a lot of overlap here because, there are passages that we're going to talk about here in a moment that show the uniqueness of family conflict. But in reality, a lot of the principles that we're going to draw for this comes from the other passages that we talked about when it comes to church conflict as well. So as you mentioned, this is a critical topic. And I think it's important that we talk about this because every family does experience this. Mm-hmm. And yet, at the same time, if families don't have the resources or the ability or the tools that they need to resolve conflict, family can be not an enjoyable thing.
Right.
It can be a place you don't want to go home to. It can lead to great friction in the home. It can lead to breakdown in relationships and marriages and family dynamics. And so I don't think it's an understatement to say that this may be one of the most important topics that we have to deal with because it's going to happen in every single home.
Yeah, it's interesting when you were talking and you said looking forward to coming home. I thought, why are the holidays so stressful? Because people have family coming over or they're going to their family's house for the holiday. And so you're seeing all these people once again, right? We're talking more the immediate family, but just generally speaking, there's always conflict, brothers, sisters, moms, dads, parents, whatever, like there happens to be. So yeah, we want to talk about that so that way people can have households that can resolve it. Because here's the thing, if you have a household that has zero conflict, which I would say probably doesn't exist, but that doesn't mean it's healthy just because there's no conflict. So the opposite of a conflict, family has conflict, is not a healthy, no conflict family, but it's a family that can rightfully deal with conflict when it comes around.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. We're not aiming here for complete perfect relationships where there's peace all the time and no problems and no discord. It just doesn't exist. So we have to have the right goal in mind here. And the goal, I tell guys this many times when I'm talking to them about, temptations of lust. I said the goal is not the absence of temptation.
Right.
You're going to face the temptation. The goal is having victory over those temptations when they come. And I think the principle is kind of the same here. The goal is not the absence of conflict in your home.
Right.
Because it's just frankly the byproduct of sinners living in a close relationship. So the goal, I think, to be healthy is, or a correct goal in mind is to say, okay, when the conflict happens, how do we resolve it in a way that honors the Lord?
Yeah, that's good because if you're not ready for it, and not that you're going around behind every door looking for conflict, but if you're not ready for it and it comes up, you're more apt to emotionally react instead of biblically respond.
Very good.
So first of all, I want to start here. And these are just three things I thought of, right? And so I hope you got a few more you can add to it. But what makes the difference between conflict in the church and conflict in the family? So as we said, the principles, for the most part, are the same, but there is a difference between these. And I was thinking about this. It's like when you're dating somebody and she gets to go home after you have a fight. She gets to go home and you get to stay in your house or whatever. And so then you can take 2 or 3 days. Maybe you text one another, email, or I don't know, whatever kids do these days. And then you come back and you see each other. Same thing with church. You have some time between there. But when you and your wife have a conflict, you're sleeping next to her. You're waking up, having breakfast with her, right? And so
Yeah.
I think one of the key components is you're going to see each other on a very regular basis. So you don't have the luxury of telling your wife, hey, I want to go away for a week to kind of work this thing out, and then I'm going to come back, because that's really not how it works.
It doesn't work that way. That's the uniqueness of a family. You live together. You engage in life together. You discuss things. There's shared experiences. You just have these relationships that are close. And anytime you have close relationships, whether it's believers or unbelievers in the church, outside the church, anytime you have close relationships in that kind of environment, there's going to be some friction.
Right.
So I think you're right that you're just going to, by the nature of being a family, you're going to see each other more often. There's greater proximity. And so the potential for conflict is ramped up just because of all that.
Yeah, that's good. The other one is you know more about this person. So you have history, especially looking at the husband and wife. You've been married. You guys have been married over 20 years now. So you guys have a little bit of history together, a few different states. And so the track record that you have, there may be a tendency to kind of lump these experiences together or not forget the experience or something like that. So someone can say, well, you've been doing this for the last 10 years or 15 years, right? So you have to be careful that the conflict in the family is unique, because outside of, we have church, you're close, but you don't have that close proximity history. You have history, but not the daily grind of life together, right?
And so the temptation in those kinds of environments is to say things like "you always,"
right?
"You never,"
right?
Because you have a history with those people, and you remember how they responded before, and how you responded before, and so, just the fact that you know more about this person contributes to the fact that there can be greater difficulties in the home.
Yeah, and then the other one is, and I think this one's really important, is the people that we're with, our family. We love them and we cherish them, and so when conflict arises, we can take it much more personal. So maybe somebody in the church does something, and it hurts, but they can't cut you so deep. But man, a family member, when they do something, man, that can really leave a scar, because you're emotionally and husband and wife physically attached to one another, and so that conflict that comes can be really painful.
And it's your family. You have one family.
Yeah, you have. Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah,
and
right.
So when those relationships are strained and difficult, it becomes more difficult, because you can't exchange your family. You can't trade it in, for another model.
At least you're not supposed to.
Not supposed to. We wouldn't recommend that. And so and I think that's partly what God does. He forces you into those circumstances and situations where you actually have to respond in a godly way.
Yeah.
But it does make it more difficult because of all of that.
No, that's really good. So those are just three things, kind of the difference between a church, conflict in a church like we talked about a few months ago, versus conflict in the family. So maybe you could say some of the advantages you have, perhaps, being in a church. You don't have those same advantages for being in a family, where, as you just said, you are forced, pigeonholed, whatever, into, you're going to have to work this out because you're here, right? And so, secondly, we talked about this a little bit in the introduction, but family conflicts are inevitable. We live in a sinful world. We are sinful people. We live with sinful people. And it has to arise. And my mind always, and I had it written down here, goes back to Genesis 4. I mean, you have a very small population on the earth, and you already have...
4?
Yes, and you already have murder. And it's obviously between related people, but it's interesting how it's brothers. And, you see this conflict arise where, one brother... perhaps jealous of the other brother and didn't get the same recognition, and all of a sudden murder comes. And so you see this family conflict all the way back in Genesis.
I mean, that's instructive for us. The very first family suffers from this, and the very first family lost a family member due to conflict. And so, I mean, we're not 10,000 or not 10,000. We're not 1,000 years into world existence or population. I mean, you're the very first 4 people to walk the earth, and this happens. That tells us just the nature of this dynamic. And you can just go even through the Old Testament. You can look at the conflict that David's sons and children had with the each other and all of those things. And you just look through other godly families and it's there. It's just present. It's just part of the dynamic of being a family. So it's inevitable. So I don't think people listening should have the expectation that we're never going to have conflict in our family. You're going to. The issue is not do you have it or not. The issue is how do you work through it.
Yeah, the obvious one too is Joseph, and you think of him and his brothers, and so how his brothers reacted versus what his dad said to him, and obviously you go on down the line, Genesis 50:20, and God intended for evil, or you intended for evil, God intended for good,
Right.
and so you see that as well. So he had a little time to prepare his heart, sitting in prison and other places, right? I think it's important that we see that, and I like that point you drew out was like, look, there's a handful of people on the earth, so you can't blame your environment because the earth was, well, not perfect. It certainly wasn't what it is now.
Right.
And so you can't blame your other family members because it wasn't like they were in-laws. You can't blame the school system. You can't blame your work system. You can't blame the government.
Right.
Didn't exist yet.
Right.
And so you have to blame yourself. You see this sinful nature.
Which is the issue.
Which is
right?
the issue.
It's the human heart. It is the human heart coming out. James 4, we talked about it, I think, in the previous podcast on this issue. What is the source of your conflicts and quarrels? It's what you're waging. It's what the lusts that wage war within you. It's these desires inside the heart that want our way. And when we put those expectations down deep into the ground or hold them very tightly and won't let them go, that's where the conflict comes. And so it is a heart issue. It's not necessarily an environmental issue, it's a heart issue.
Yeah.
And that's what God is bringing out in our families when those things happen.
No, it's really good. And kind of, for me, you fast forward to the New Testament and you think, okay, Jesus is coming. This is going to be great. He's going to come, peace on earth, goodwill to men, right? And then Jesus says in Matthew 10, do not think that I came to bring peace on earth. It's like, well, wait a minute. These shepherds were all like, hey, peace on earth, goodwill to men. But then he says, I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I came to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's enemies will be the members of his household. Now, you're going to be teaching on this in about 6 years or 7 years when you get there, Matthew. 8 years? Anyway.
Maybe.
But just run this down, because here's the rub that people think. If I get saved, or if we get saved, there's going to be peace in my household because Jesus is in my heart and everything is going to be running smooth. So what is Jesus saying here as he's talking about this?
Well, he's saying that those who know him and love him and worship him and come to know him as Lord and Savior are going to find themselves at odds with those who are not his. So yeah, will you becoming a believer change your relationships? Absolutely, it will, in that God has changed your heart and helped you then see with new eyes in how to treat and love and care for mom or dad or brother or sister. But if you've got unbelievers still in the home, that doesn't, what Jesus is saying, there's still going to be conflict.
Right.
Because, and I would add to that, even if everyone's a believer in your home,
There's still going to be conflict.
there's still going to be conflict. So being believers certainly minimizes the conflict, or at least gives the resources and the means by which you deal with the conflict. But if you've got believers and unbelievers together in the same home, this is true. It is a spiritual issue. It's a spiritual conflict. And so I think you have to be aware of that. And we have to be cognizant of the fact that those in a family who don't know the Lord are not able to understand spiritual things. It's not that they can't, it's not that they choose not to understand them, it's that they can't understand them because they're spiritually appraised. And so 1 Corinthians 2:14 tells us that. So you're going to have to navigate. If you've got unsaved mom or dad or husband or wife or children, you have to remember that these are all spiritual things that are in operation here.
So because typically what will happen, you have two unsaved. We have this, many people in our church actually. So you have husband and wife, one of them gets saved and they start coming to church. We have two men I can think of specifically got saved. Wives weren't saved, they started coming to church. A little bit hostile, how do I lead my wife? And so you have somebody, maybe you can talk on this. I know it's not in our notes, I'm gonna throw you a curveball. You got the husband who is saved. How does he shepherd his unsaved wife? How can he practically do that?
Yeah, well, he's going to have to be extremely humble, and he's going to have to be extremely patient, and he's going to have to remember that he was once like her, right? So he can't get angry, frustrated, mean. He can't try to force spiritual things upon her. He has to lovingly and graciously care for her as God did to him before he came to know Christ. So I think in the issue of conflict, he's going to have to be willing to die to himself and swallow his pride and love his wife as Christ loved the church. And that's going to be a challenge at times if she's not a believer, or vice versa.
Sure.
It's going to be a challenge, but that doesn't change. He doesn't say love your wife as Christ loved the church if she's a believer.
Right.
There's no caveats there. So there's no out. You still have to practice the biblical principles.
No, I think that's really helpful. And I like this proverb. I just threw this at the end. Proverbs 11:29. He who troubles his own house will inherit wind. I love that. So what does that mean? What does it mean? You taught on the Proverbs. What does it mean to inherit wind?
Well, you're going to bring a storm upon your family. I'm assuming that's what that means.
Yeah.
Wind does damage.
Yeah.
And if you are going to be a source of conflict in your home, then you're going to invite all kinds of destruction and discord into your family.
Yeah, so if you're a husband, wife, mother, father, if you're a kid listening, if you want to bring discord into your family, you're going to be bringing in these troubles.
Right.
It's a guarantee.
Yeah.
Like you're not going to be, you're not going to abstain from that, or it's not going to happen to you.
Yeah.
You're going to be bringing this in, so
Right.
that's good. And so then, how can we? So we know that they're there. We understand that they are different than what you would see in the church. So some of the principles are the same, and so that's what we want to pull out right now. So the question is then, conflicts arise in the home. We understand they're going to. So how do we as believers then resolve these conflicts in a biblical way?
Yeah, we talked about this before. So I think the place you start then is with the biblical principles that inform those familial relationships. So this is maybe where the uniqueness of conflict resolution in the family comes to bear. So you have principles for the husband and wife in Scripture. Ephesians 5 tell us that a husband needs to love and sacrifice and care for his wife. A wife needs to respect her husband. So those need to come into play in those conflicts. I think when you have children involved, those children need to obey their parents, Ephesians 6:1, and they're called to honor their parents, Ephesians 6:2 and 3. So those would be some specific principles that would mitigate some of that conflict. Children need to be taught to obey their parents, and if they choose not to, then there needs to be consequences for that. So those are some of the specific passages. You can keep reading in Ephesians 6. You have Ephesians 6:4 telling parents what they're supposed to do. They need to bring their children up in the fear and admonition of the Lord. So I think the starting place in dealing with conflict in the family is making sure that each family member understands their roles, even if they're believers or not, children in particular, but they understand what God expects of them and they need to follow those principles. So if those things are not taking place, there's going to be conflict. Now, there's still going to be conflict even if those things are taking place, but those things have to be in place in the first place.
So you have to know what you have to do, essentially, right? So because if you don't know what you're supposed to do, then you're not going to be able to do it.
Exactly.
So your first thing to do to make sure that you understand these, and like that Ephesians 5 passage, I mean, it's super easy to go through, and you can just sit down and see exactly what it is that God expects for families to do. But going back to like the husband's responsibility, how does the husband loving his wife properly, how does that help to kind of mitigate or make sure that when conflict does arise, it's not like a volcano going off, but they're able to actually get that conflict and resolve it in a biblical way?
I think that's one of the ways that the husband builds trust with his wife. If she knows she's loved and cherished, if she knows that he cares for her, and there's conflict, yeah, but he loves her. He truly has her heart. If that's the case, then in those moments of conflict, she's not going to erupt because there's a foundation of trust.
That's good.
There's a foundation of love. There's a foundation of care. They've navigated these things and they've been through some tough times, and there's a tenderness there between the two of them. So, but if that foundation isn't there, then every conflict is another opportunity for division in the family. So it really does come back to, in the case of a husband and a wife, fulfilling your roles. Husband, do you love your wife? And wives, do you respect your husband? And if those are the foundations, then you're going to navigate any of those conflicts wisely, because there's a foundation that's there that you can work from. But if the trust isn't there, the commitment is not there, that's another big one. If there's always questions in the back of each other's minds,
motives.
Questioning motives. But even more importantly than that, is this person really committed to me anymore? If you're starting to ask those questions, you're in trouble.
Right.
So conflict is mitigated, first of all, by expressing your commitment to one another, knowing that, listen, I'm not going anywhere. We're going to work through this. I love you. I care for you. I'm committed to this marriage. I'm not looking for a way out. Those kinds of things.
Oh, that's good. And I think the next question I'll have for you, I feel like I just get to shoot you a bunch of questions. This is good. This is my favorite podcast.
I'm going to turn the tables here in just a moment.
So I was thinking, right, you have two kind of mindsets, and families are like this. And I'm not familiar with the family you grew up with, but some families like to sweep everything under the rug, and they say, everything's fine. And then other families, let's go head on and just get this thing taken care of. So is there a middle ground, or is there a time to sweep things under the rug and fill your closet? Or is it you have to hit every single thing head on to make sure it's taken care of? Or is there a balance that lies there when you're talking about conflict in the family?
Well, yeah, I think you can swing the pendulum to either extreme too far. So the sweep it under the rug pendulum is unwise, because just after time, bricks build up in the home to the point where kids are going to grow up and they're going to want to get out of the home. And when the kids are out of the home, mom and dad don't talk to each other anymore. That's not wise, because you've built up these mountains of issues. That's not wise. But if you swing the pendulum to the other side, where every issue is a conflict, you're going at it, going to the mats on every single issue, well, that's not wise either.
Right.
So in that sense, yeah, there is a balance there, that there has to be a forgiveness, there has to be a bearing with one another, there has to be a letting love cover a multitude of sins, there has to be a deferring to one another, there has to be a willingness to overlook offenses. I mean, if that doesn't happen, then every issue becomes a source of conflict. So yeah, you have to have a willingness to bear with one another, but if there are issues that continue to come up and you feel like there's a root of bitterness growing up in your heart towards a child, or a child toward a parent, or siblings with each other, I mean, we tell our kids all the time, listen, you got to work this out. You have to go talk to your sibling. You have to have a conversation with them. What does Matthew 18 say? You go and you have the conversation. If they sin against you, you go talk to them about it. So either you overlook it, there's two options. Either you overlook it or you address it.
And by overlooking it, you're done.
You're done. You have to overlook it. So, but I think there are times where you do have to have the hard conversations.
Sure.
I mean, you have to say the things that are on your heart, because if you don't, bitterness will creep in and the relationships will become increasingly strained. So I think in answer to your question, there is a middle ground. At times you're going to have to just overlook those offenses and be willing to swallow your pride and let love cover those sins. On the other hand, there's going to be times where you have to say the hard things in love, patiently, kindly, gently.
Yeah, I think that's key, right? Ephesians, speak the truth in love. And so it's not just verbal diarrhea coming out saying everything that's been wrong, right? But it's actually saying in love. And I think that's really, really key. The other thing that I point out as well would be knowing the differences between preferences that annoy you and sins that are against you. because I think as married couples, especially as time goes on, we could get annoyed easier. Why do you keep doing that? Why do you use a spoon with your spaghetti, right? Or whatever it is that people do.
Toilet paper on the roll. What
Yeah,
side
I mean,
goes
that
up?
one right there, that one sets you off, right? Rolls the wrong way. But, so yeah.
Thermostat at 68 versus 74.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And so we have to be able to, and I like what you said, if you overlook that, because that, it's not an offense as in crossing the line, transgression, a sin, but you can look at it like, well, she knows I like this and she's doing this anyway, so now you're offended where perhaps your wife or your husband never meant any offense. And so you have to be able to say, that's just my preference. And so there's no real offense there. It's just, I want it one way and she wants it
I think
another.
a good litmus test for that is, can you tie it to a book, chapter, and verse in the Bible?
Right.
If you can't, well, maybe you just need to overlook that.
Right.
Right. So talk a little bit about, I'm turning the tables now.
I saw that was a
Did
good
you
transition.
Did you see that transition? Talk a little bit, because I think this is going to be the issue for a lot of families, is conflict with the kids. Conflict between the kids and conflict between the parents and the kids. I think we've dealt a little bit with conflict between married couples. But what about when the kids are involved, and maybe when you get closer to the teenage years and you've got some rebellion in the home? I think that's probably the scenarios where most of our families are really going to struggle a little bit more. What do you do in those cases?
Well, you're the one with teenagers. Just throwing that
I'm
out
asking
there.
you the question.
Yeah, I think that's really key, right? So, first of all, if you were raising your children, and I know not everyone has this, you got saved later in life, so maybe your kids are older, and so they were raised without the biblical principles, and so now your kids are older, so you're trying to go back and put those biblical principles. That's going to be harder. You're just going to have to understand, because you let your kids get away with things, or you didn't discipline them properly, and now you're trying to, and so you got a 10, 11, 12-year-old who's used to going this direction, and now you as a newly saved parent are trying to go in this direction, and they're going to be fighting you along the way. You're just going to have to understand that it is what it is.
Yeah.
Now, if you look at the other case where your family, you had your kids built up on biblical principles, the hope is that when they get to that age, and I'm seeing it with my own kids, that you're able to shepherd them and discipline them in the proper direction as you're going, but there's still going to be conflict. Like, you still have conflict with kids. And I would say most importantly to remember is there's a good chance your kids aren't saved. And so we have to understand exactly what you said, 1 Corinthians 2, is you can't expect them to understand biblical principles because they have an unspiritual mind. And so it's not that they're rebelling against you, it's that they don't understand the biblical principles. So you as a parent are shepherding them towards the gospel first and foremost. Secondly, it is behavior, because at that stage you need them to understand they're behaving because they need to submit to your authority. And then as they submit to your authority, the prayer is that they understand that even you as a parent are submitting to the authority that God's given you. And so then they will, hopefully when they leave or they're saved, and then they submit to God's authority. So practically speaking, you have to understand the stages that your kids are in. There's a stage where they need logic, right? So why are you asking me to do this? It's not necessarily them talking back, but it's their mind are starting to develop, and they want to know, why do you choose A when B, C, and D to them seem just as valid? And so you have to have conversations with them as they grow up. Punishment changes as well. You're not spanking your 13, 14, 15-year-old, but they have privileges now. And so, you're taking those privileges away, and you're telling them, look, you've lost some trust from your parents. We've given you 6 feet of rope, and now we're going to take 2 feet back, as it were. So those kind of conversations, as I said, I don't have teenagers, so these are the things that I'm prepping myself for. And you can tell me all the ways I was wrong because you've already been through it and are going through it right now.
Yeah.
So
No, I think that's good. It starts early. It starts by laying these principles of resolving conflict with each other at an early age.
Like siblings as well.
Yeah, as mom and dad, you need to lay the foundation with your kids as soon as they're 2 and 4 and they're starting to squabble. And I mean, even there, you're having those conversations about heart issues and selfishness and pride. And so hopefully by the time they're in the teen years, they're past that, or at least they've been able to be instructed and taught in how to resolve conflict with each other so that there can be a sweet and harmonious home. I think the challenge comes in the teen years when a child chooses to rebel against what mom and dad have taught them, and there's years of conflict in the home. And then, legally, when they're under 18, you're still responsible for them. So, you really can't do anything legally other
Right.
than you need to figure out how to keep some harmony in the home. But, it may come to a point where if the child is over 18 and that child is undermining parenting of the rest of the kids, or is completely rebellious and engaged in a rebellious lifestyle, it may come to a point where mom or dad has to say, listen, you need to leave our home. You're an adult now legally, and you're damaging and threatening the unity of our family. That's a tough thing, and I'm not saying you should jump at that and should hope for that at the first opportunity, but that may come to that occasion and that opportunity.
Yeah, I would say with that, you probably have a goal post set up, right?
Yeah.
Like, here's 3 months if this changes, so you're not just, they turn 18, oh, you did this wrong, it's time for you to leave, Johnny, right? So
right.
yeah, no, I understand. I think that's good advice. So, because the goal is to have harmony in the home, and you don't want something there that's undermining that harmony intentionally.
Exactly.
So yeah, no, that's good. Well, I hope this was helpful for you guys. If you have any other questions regarding families and conflict resolution with teens, you can email Todd, and he'd be more than happy to help you out. No, I hope you guys have a really good rest of the week, and we'll see you soon.